bit about what inspired your career in archives and curation and how you actually got started? Where did you actually go to school at, and what did you study?
Okay. I actually I was an undergraduate at Georgetown University, and I was working at a time when very few people at Georgetown were interested in African American history. There was in fact an elective course on African American history, but for me, I think the hook was I I took a 20th century course where we all did research papers, and I did my research on, and this, you have to bear in mind, this was in 1978, so this is a long time ago. I did my research paper on Freedom Southern Summer in Mississippi, and it was completely eye-opening for me. For one thing, I grew up not really understanding what the civil rights movement was. I mean, this is what it was like to be in white America at that time. You know, as a teenager, I was not aware of what happened during the 1960s. And more importantly, it opened up a view of essentially Black culture that I had never really considered or thought about, because I was very interested in the idea that the SNCC activists were setting up schools that taught history to Black children, and that it was Black history. And I really became interested in learning what that was. And I made my own way and ultimately went to the University of Maryland, where I worked with Ira Berlin on the Freedmen and Southern Society project. And that project, for those who, I mean, basically it was a very important project in my development because it was a documentary project. And it was not strictly archival, but I was steeped in the archives. And I spent a lot of time at the National Archives learning how the records of the military were organized and ways of beginning to understand emancipation and some of the events that Black people participated in terms of pressing for their freedom, and ways of finding that out and piecing it together. And I worked with a woman named Sarah Dunlop Jackson, who was an archivist, and I found her very inspiring. And I thought a long time about teaching, but ultimately I ended up getting some professional work working at the Historical Society of Washington. And that work, working with manuscripts and collections management, really is what opened it up for me. So I have a PhD in history, and ultimately over time I decided to get archival certification. And I think one of the things that's really important about my career at the time I was coming up, there was a lot more fluidity in the allied professions. And so it enabled me to do work, and where you are right, Aisha, is that I did historical research, I did interpretation, I've done work on helping to establish, helping people with begin to understand the Black history of their sites. I've worked with people, actually on museum projects, doing collections management for those. And I've also done work as been an archivist, a curator, and now I'm actually moving into a new job. I'm going to be the librarian of Slavery, Memory, and Reconciliation at Georgetown. So I've had all these titles during my life, and I've just been a complete hybrid. And I am not at all unusual especially for the generation that I come out of. So.
And can you explain to us maybe some of the compare and contrast the differences of those various roles, the difference of what you would do as a curator versus an archivist versus a librarian? So we're here at iSchool, we have an archivist program, we have the MARA program, and we have the library science program. So they're like two different pathways that people can take. But I'm interested in both. There's like so much crossover. So if you can share, maybe compare and contrast your experience doing the various types of work in those roles.
Well, I think actually, I can say is, one of the major differences between museums and archives, and that's where I've had the most direct experience, is first, what I would say that unites them is that there's an interest in provenance, and the idea that that's a foundational concept is extremely important. In other words, that it's very important to document how something was created. Now, the thing that's hard is that, especially for museum folks, they have a hard time getting their head around the idea that archivists are concerned with the way a set of papers is created. When you refer to the creator of a collection, you're really referring to the person or organization that was organizing files and that was deciding to keep papers. Whereas for museum folks, the concern is over the object. So when they research an object, it tends to, first of all, be, they do look at their collections as a whole as to who created those collections, but they're also really concerned with things like how it's made, when something was new, what it originally looked like. Now, the role I'm going to step into as a librarian, this will be the first time I'm actually a librarian. I think the key difference for me is that I'm going to be working with resources that are created in different ways, including books and databases, and I'm going to be doing more instruction. So I'm basically going to be more of a reference person. Now, what I've come to learn about working with librarians, for librarians, it's really important to be able to describe and categorize and classify materials easily. So for them, there's I don't want to say provenance is not important, but for them, I think the intellectual challenges have far more to do with developing classification systems and making sure that they can be used. But what I will say overall, the trend in the allied professions, and it's because of really digitization and the number of digital objects out there, is to being able to control individual items. I mean, even archivists are going to have to learn, have to basically, create metadata for individual digital objects that they're going to be getting. And that's a change, a profound change in the archival profession. So.
Okay. So what led you to consider, I guess, the curator role at Georgetown specifically? Was that just based on your experience from school, or because of your interest in African American history, or a specific project that they were working on? How did you come to work at Georgetown?
First of all, my dissertation was on the Black community in the District of Columbia. So my research and my specialized knowledge is directly related to the work that I do. And Aisha, I don't know if I shared with you, but I created a research guide on studying Washington. And that is a reflection of years and years and years of my experience studying Washington. I also understand the literature and the whole field of slavery studies. So that has also, it's definitely a case where specialized knowledge of the field has been really important. I came on to Georgetown actually as a consultant, and my first role was to appraise the collections they had at Georgetown and to begin to identify. When I started, and I started in 2016, so that was the year that Georgetown, basically that Rachel Swarns published her articles on Georgetown and the relationship of the descendants to Georgetown, what their reckoning meant for understanding what Georgetown owed to them. And of course, where Georgetown found itself was that there was a history that everybody, well, I don't want to say everybody in Georgetown, that was well known among faculty and staff and even some students at Georgetown, that the Jesuits had sold more than 300 people to finance, to basically clear some debts for Georgetown and actually finance the growth of missions in the United States. It was the money was used for far bigger purposes than saving Georgetown. But I think the key thing that they found is that their collections were very obscure to people. So the working group on slavery memory reconciliation that was organized by the president's office had to really begin to make their records more accessible. And the first step was assessing collections. And it had to assess the collections for a couple of reasons. One was that there was a lack of recognition of what they had in their various collections. I felt when I started there and I was working with, and I have to emphasize that the leadership of my department at that time was very different than the leadership that I have within my department and in the library now. But, literally they would ask me, well, where do you, where do you see documents related to slavery? And I was literally like everywhere, anywhere I went, I saw it, because first of all, the Jesuits themselves, they not only owned people, but they evangelized among them. So there were records related to slavery in their pastoral records as well as in their financial records. And then, of course, there's tracing the money trail, and looking at the Georgetown College financial ledgers. I mean, to show you how much things changed when I was doing my dissertation and I wanted to work on, I asked questions about using the Georgetown College financial records. And I asked about, whether or not there were records on slave hiring, and they told me no, that it wasn't there. And I can't say what made or break my dissertation, but I did use the Holy Trinity Catholic Church records. And I think if I had a broader understanding and it was led to other areas of the collections, that some of my interpretation would have been very different. So I was fully aware of what was what the costs of this were, in terms of preventing people from understanding the history. So my first job, this is a very long way of saying, my first job was assessing the collections. And also the other reason why I assessed the collections is that the Georgetown University does not own intellectual rights to the records of the Jesuits. The Jesuits do. So we needed a full accounting of, this was just a question of property and policy. We needed a full accounting of what the Jesuits actually owned. And we've then shaped agreements where the Jesuits, in cooperation with us, basically agreed to a rearrangement, reparative description of their work, and also the digitization of all of the records dated before 1900. And that project should be completed, I would say, by the end of the summer. I mean, fully completed. We have a new finding aid up. We have a new arrangement. We have a new description. You can go and you can see digital objects attached to every file folder that has documents that are dated before 1900. And there's now another project underway. It's called the Extension Project, but really what that is looking at the papers of individual priests and other related collections. And I expect that project will make big headway on not just the smaller collections that document the history of enslavement, but there's also a part of this legacy that is immediately in the post-war and in the early 20th century. The Jesuits were part of, they were a major part of the economy in Maryland, and they're a major part of the pastoral lives of the Black people of Maryland through the mid-1960s. And we have documentation of that as well. Mm-hmm. So that's more or less where we are. And basically, I'm moving into a position where I'm going to be doing more outreach with community members, not including descendant groups, but also including some community organizations. I mean, if there's one thing about the DC community, and DC doesn't have a major historical society like the Chicago Historical Society, but it definitely has community groups that want to learn more about their neighborhoods and their history. And we're working with groups that are doing that. We're beginning to work with groups that are interested in documenting the cemeteries in Washington, but also the Jesuit cemeteries as well. So this is all part of the work that I've been doing. And it's been logical, and, you know, and part of it was forced by the pandemic. I think we're going to be on the cutting edge of some reparative description, and I think that's important as well.
What would you say would be some of the challenges that you've had in creating and maintaining and managing the collection, especially during the pandemic? What would you say some of the challenges that you had to face, and how did you deal with them?
Well, the first challenge I just mentioned is that the Jesuits owned the collections, and it took a while to broker an agreement with them, and we do report to them, you know, monthly. I would say the biggest obstacle that the pandemic posed was that all employees had to go home for a full year, and that included people in, you know, in LIT, which is our department that does digitization. It really wasn't until August of, there were some people who were brought on campus because they needed to be, including the archivist of the Maryland province, but they weren't brought back to campus until January of 2021. I didn't start back on campus until August of 2021. And there's the obvious obstacle of absences and people not being able to do work. But a lot of the work that we've done, you know, I don't want to say depends upon student support, but is supported by student workers. And we weren't able to work with them. So it definitely slowed things down. It slowed down the collaborative process quite a bit. You know, I think a lot of us, and myself included, the Washington, D.C., you know, resources guide that I developed was largely because of the fact that I was at home during the pandemic and I needed to do most of my work online. So not having physical access to the documents was a big problem. I still feel like we're coming out of it. I think next year is probably going to be the first year that's going to feel close to normal again. This year, it feels like we've been taking baby steps. But no place functions well if it's closed. And that's what we had to do.
So what did that look like or feel like, having to do all of your work online compared to physical records, like your day-to-day? How did it change when you were forced to work virtually?
Well, for me, the immediate impact, the way the work process worked, the processing of the collection worked, is that we hired an archivist who was she had just finished her MLS. She had a PhD in history. She's extremely capable. She's an excellent writer. She's wonderful. And one of the problems for her was that she came into a project where I had worked with the library staff and other people on staff to plan it out. So in actuality, as part of the proposal and part of the rearrangement of the collection, I had worked on defining the series. And for me, the biggest change was that when we had to go home, I could not consult the records, because what I was doing was assigning folders or groups of folders to, series. And I still claim, because my last day at Georgetown was, I think, May 12th of 2020. I still claim if I had the full month of March, I could have finished at least the physical work I needed to do. And it would have made her, she would have been able to pick right up on what I had to do, on what I had done. So I ended up backpedaling when I got back and still working on some of those files and examining things. I have touched every single file that's been part of the Maryland Province Archives collection. And part of it was in order for us to gain intellectual control over the collection. I was looking at every single folder. And I should preface this by saying that the one reason why we decided to rearrange and reprocess the collection was that there were literally about 60 series for the archives, and it was not integrated with some other collections where it logically should have been. We had a separate collection called the Maryland Province Collection, that collection had been acquired in the early 20th century. The Maryland Province Archives had been acquired in 1977. So we were integrating these two collections, and at the same time working on a different series description. And would have been easy if we could have said this series belongs with, a subheading, but it just did not work out that neatly. Somewhere in there, somebody lost track of what the organization of the collection was when they got it. And so we were really trying to recreate that.
Okay. How do you see the fields of archives and curatorial work in the future, knowing that, a lot of things are online, a lot of things are digitized, working virtually has become more of the norm? What do you see in the future, like for students like myself that are going, like what can we expect, especially when you have reparative work that's being done? What are some trends or some things that you see that we should be aware of, or some things that you think might be helpful for us to know?
Well, there are two big things that I see happening, and both trends are underway. I think I obviously this really is referring mostly to academic libraries. There has to be a change in the way we describe and think of our collections, because most academic libraries have a rather imperial view, meaning that they were collected by people. In many cases, they were interested and fascinated by the leaders of the organizations and the people that they were documenting. And we know that there's a bias because of who can read and who can write. But even on top of that, there was a bias in the way people collected, because the types of people that they were interested in looking at were often very powerful people, and people who were, uncritically looked at. And one of the things I think that's going to be extremely important, and was part of the Maryland Province Archives project for us, was to complicate that picture. In the case of the Maryland Province Archives, these collections and papers were valued by the Jesuits. For one thing, the Jesuits value everything that's theirs, right? It's a strong community. They have a strong lineage, and honestly, that's not the principal problem. In fact, in a way, it's good for us because they kept their history. But what they did is that they were extremely interested in their role as founding the Catholic Church in the United States. The Maryland province is the direct descendant of missions in Maryland, and they were the first Catholic missions in what is now the United States, or what was British North America, by founding it in 1634. So we have records, very, very sketchy documentation, but nonetheless documentation of their encounter with indigenous peoples, which is quite significant because in Maryland, the Piscataway nations and the Algonquin peoples are pushed out of that colony by the early 18th century. But also too, we have records of the early years of enslavement in Maryland. So it is very comparable to what the University of Virginia is dealing with, where they can be proud that Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States, the writer of the Declaration of Independence, founded the University of Virginia. But there is a dark side and an intrinsically important side that cannot be separated from the legacy that people are proud of that is related to enslavement. So I think one challenge is archivists are going to have to think about ways of approaching their description that does not minimize these stories and that does not minimize the privilege and does not minimize the relationships that the people they've been collecting have with marginalized peoples. It's especially important for organizational papers like the Maryland Province Archives. So that's and the other side of it, which has gotten, I think, more attention, I believe, is that, you know, so what I'm saying is that people have to be more careful about the way they write their collections finding aid. How do you write a scope and contact note? How do you write a biography? Include the whole biography of this person, you know, look at their relationship to their broader population. But the second thing, and this is what people are, you know, really interested too in, is reparative description. And that means that the language that you use in finding aids, we've had to be very, very conscious of the fact that the language that was used in the old finding aids is offensive. The number of times Negro is used as a descriptor, not as a title of a folder, which, you know, we really probably would not touch, but as a descriptor. And all colored, you know, the word color, all of this had to be really carefully looked at and edited. So and that's a major part of the work of archivists. And that is, of course, related to looking at the classification system that the Library of Congress has developed and looking at ways of repairing catalogs. So for most archivists, subject terms are not nearly as important as they are for, you know, book catalogers. But then all of us are going to have to become really important and aware of the fact that the digital world, and this is the other trend that I see, and I have to admit, this is the trend that I am not directly involved in, but with the world and with the fact that digital objects are going to have to be described, that people are going to be accepting manuscript collections that are in digital format. All of this is going to change the work of description for archivists substantially. And two, it's what's going to happen is that the descriptive methods that have been developed by librarians, museum catalogers, and archivists are going to be more similar than they have ever been. And I'm not exactly sure how, you know, the allied professions are very protective of their domain. I don't necessarily think that's going to break down, but I do think that the descriptive work is going to become very, very similar. And I actually think, you know, ChatGPT might have some impact, but I'm hoping not. So all of these are trends, and I have to admit, and this is, you know, myself, I did at one point back, I guess about 10 years ago, when the SAA was starting to do digital archive certification, I thought, oh, I'll do this, and it was a pretty good introduction to digital collections and the importance of, you know, electronic hubs. But I pretty much decided after doing a seminar on arranging and describing electronic records that if I had to do it, I would not be able to do it. It's just, that was not me. And I know, and I fully respect people who find that as a challenge, but that I understood was not me. And what I will have to say though, is that the analog, the physical object is never going to lose its impact. You know, the ability to exhibit materials that are, you know, that are, that document the lives of people in the past, that offer people insight in a tangible way of getting at really the dead and honoring the dead and helping people to understand what that life was like, is I think forever going to be important. I mean, if you think about the importance of cemeteries to people and how destructive, you know, the fact that so many cemeteries that buried Black people have been desecrated, what that means culturally, that there's no physical place for people to go to honor their ancestors. And in many ways, being able to see physically a document, to see physically an object, is going to remain extremely important.
Definitely. I definitely agree. We had to do a paper recently on, you had to pick which one to argue for, either the physical or to digitize things to preserve them. That was a very hard paper to write. How would you say or give advice in terms of work-life balance when it comes to staying up to date with the latest developments in our industry and in our field and the work you do between, you know, outreach and, you know, keeping your hands on everything and helping with reference? There's a lot to juggle. What advice would you give in terms of, you know, staying up to date, contributing knowledge and information in the field, as well as doing the actual work?
That's a really good question. You're talking to somebody who works really hard. I do, and I don't have a nuclear family of my own, so you know, I've become accustomed to being somebody who can come in late, and I put in extra hours, and to me, and part of it also is that we didn't really focus on this, but especially the early part of my career, I was freelance, so I managed my own hours, and the only way I could get work was to keep working and making sure my work was out there. And that's challenging because you never feel like you've got a job, and that you're always trying to get the new gig coming up, and you really have to expend a lot of energy on that. I honestly think, and the other thing too, I will say, and I can say this, you know, at my age, I'm not close to retirement age, at least mentally, you know, but many people I know who are my age and retiring, it's usually paradigm shifts that, you know, things that they decide they don't want to keep up with anymore. That's usually what brings them to retirement. You know, the designer who realizes that they don't want to do everything online. You know, the archivist who realizes that they don't want to use archive space, right? You know, that's obviously 10, 15 years ago, right? But sometimes it's, you know, people come to this when they realize they don't want to adapt to a new technology. I mean, I honestly think the key thing is that find what you enjoy. You know, if it doesn't feel like work, that's a big help. The other thing too, that at least in recent years for me is extremely helpful, is that I am in a work environment where that's encouraged. Okay. It's, you know, encouraged by the dean of the library and my supervisor. They will every year pay for a conference, but I've also, and part of it's my position, frankly, but I also know I can, if I need to go to an additional conference, I would probably be able to get the money for it. Since part of my job is outreach, it's built into it. But to be honest, one conference a year to present papers, that's actually a lot, because you're there, and you are expected, if you take this money, to be able to report on it and share with other people. So it's part of your, the collegial relationships you develop too. You want colleagues who are interested in it. So a lot of it's finding an environment that works, and it's super, super challenging, because let's face it, there's a scarcity of opportunities, and I think, especially within, everywhere within higher education and cultural organizations as well, the political climate we have is having an impact upon the types of opportunities that people have. I feel very privileged to be at Georgetown right now. And the other thing too, I should say about Georgetown, for me, the other thing that's going to keep me current is that what Georgetown is doing is, I think the reparative work is extremely important. The dialogue that they've begun to engage is extremely important. And the fact, and I truly believe that the university, in many ways, has been slow, very slow, in terms of the reparative process. But in one key way, I think they've done a lot, and that is that they pledged to hire more faculty of color, and the number of appointments they've had of Black and I want to emphasize this, Black and Hispanic people, the leadership positions they've had, it's actually quite impressive, and it changes the dialogue and it pushes things. So the Georgetown is changing, and it's exciting to be part of that change. It's part of the environment. And so if there's one piece of advice I could give you, is to be a part of an institution that's evolving and openly doing so. My hope is it becomes part of the culture, and it's that, when I say we, it's the general broad we know we can never do enough. We know we can never do enough to repair. And that's what's going to make us accountable. We are always know we have to be accountable. And that's going to keep us moving and changing and growing. So
how would you say, what is your approach to addressing ethical concerns and sensitive issues related to the collections that you manage? From policies of maybe what they're keeping, what they're not keeping, how fast things are going, to even I've had previous mentors stress the importance of work-life balance and maybe not having a supportive environment that encourages that. What is your approach to making sure that you enjoy the work that you're doing and you enjoy where you're working at?
Well, for me, I'm very lucky right now, because I'm passionate about the subject, and I'm passionate about what I'm doing. And I know that, let me put it this way, I know that the processing and the digitization of the Maryland Province Archives was actually very slow. Georgetown first pledged to do this in 2016. And the time it took to get the agreement, the time it really took to get the project off the ground and plan it, was definitely important work, and that was really slow. But I do believe that now that this project has been done, we can really open up and do so much more. One important project that I'm involved in it's called On These Grounds, and it's an attempt to really describe the records that we have by centering it on the events that occurs to enslaved people. So that means that instead of, for instance, describing the creator and putting the creator at center, it means that every single event that involves an enslaved person is put in a database. Now, this is significantly more than describing an individual object and putting, establishing metadata for that. This really is going through records, and I'm going through. Aisha knows the document. It's called the Census of 1838, and it was a document that was used to plan the sale. And every person who's mentioned is that creates an event because they were part of that planning. And a person who is listed as having run away, that's an event because that means that person ran away. There are also notes about some people who have died. That's an event. There's also an event there. So all of these individual and discrete events are described, and it'll be possible for people to search locally, at the various places that these events occur, by time, the chronological barriers, by name. So for instance, if you're interested in the Mahoney family or the Campbell family, you should be able to search these by name, and two, by the type of event. So if you're interested in resistance, you can pull up things that way. It enables people to essentially, instead of giving somebody a finding aid and explaining the logic of where they might find things, and I have to say that finding aid is critically important because it establishes what is in the collection. It describes what's in the collection, and it can point people outwards too, to external sources if it's used well and if it's written well. But in this case, it's really a question of, and in most of our cases, we're linking to documents that are digitized. So it's going to become a fantastic resource. And I would love actually people here to be able to test it out. And I'm going to have some Zoom sessions during the next few months that will enable people to test out we're creating a test site, and we're getting ready to publish it. And as we do so, we're doing it for testing and evaluation, because the full implementation of the project will come really in the next grant cycle that we have for it. And it'll be fantastic. And essentially too, it means you can regardless of the medium of document, whether it's a ledger, whether it's an inventory, whether it's a letter, diary entry, the description of the event will be in the same format. It kind of flattens out the archives for people, but if it can be done well, and it's going to need to be, ultimately, if it's really done well, people are going to have to adopt it, and it's going to require some crowdsourcing. But it'll be amazing. It's going to be an amazing resource.
Amazing.
I forget what your question was, but I had to give that project a big plug, especially since that's what I've been working on lately.
Yeah, it sounds amazing. It sounds like a new way to find information. It sounds like if you have a collection that's meant to be searched one way, but then you have another way to find that collection.
Exactly. And it literally can be
a different intention for people to find it.
Yeah, it literally can be done in the way most people ask their questions, right? For instance, if somebody were to use the archives of the Maryland province, right? And they were interested in learning about sex in the way priests understood sex among Black among the enslaved and free Black people. That's kind of a hard question to ask of an archives, right? It's like you'd go in and I can tell you where to look, because right away I would say you go to, first place to go would be to the provincial records. And why do I say that? Because the provincial was responsible for overseeing the development of missions. He was responsible for making sure that members of the society followed rules. So he was getting complaints about the way people were being treated. And that's where you see, people complaining about the types of things some priests would allow, or the types of discipline some priests would have. But if you were working on these grounds and you wanted, for instance, you had questions about punishment, or you had questions about sexual relationships, you could literally ask it by going through a menu of events that describe those things. And that can help you get at that question. So it's really, I think, fantastic. And I think the other thing too that it will enable people to do is, that certainly as a resource for genealogists, I think it's going to be extremely important, but it's also going to be important, I think, for teachers, because so many teachers are interested in, whether they realize it or not, they're interested in local history, because they can put their hands on stories that they can tell students. And high school, college students, people always respond to, this is what happened here. And I was just in a class with the archivist of the university, and both of us were doing presentations on the founding of the university, and the students really lit up at all the rules and regulations that she brought out, and it means a lot to them to know that this is what their place was like. So anyway.
So my final question that I have is, if someone is coming into positions similar to yours, what advice would you give them? What's something that maybe you wish you would have known, that maybe would have made things easier for you or changed things for you? Someone like myself, like if I'm like, oh, I want to be Mary Corrigan, and I want to go to Georgetown and work on the project. What advice would you give someone coming into a role similar to yours?
I think the most important thing, and this to me was always an advantage of Georgetown for me, is because I went to Georgetown, right? And so I understand Georgetown is a culture. There's no question about it, and a lot of schools are their own unique culture. I'm sure of schools where you can pinpoint exactly what type of things people studied. And at Georgetown, there is a distinct culture. I know the questions that sort of drive them. I understood that everybody takes a course called Problem of God, which I'm pretty sure is not something that's taught in even many Catholic schools. And so I think the most important thing is to be observant and cognizant, and to be observational, and also to see where you can contribute among people. Be very sensitive when you look at jobs. I mean, look at the individual relationships of people, see if they enjoy being with each other. I think that's a key thing to be aware of. If it looks like people don't enjoy each other, and this is if you get the opportunity to really meet people, just beware. But I think for me, probably the person this is at the very beginning of my career, the person I learned the most from was a colleague I had. I had a job as the collections manager of the University of Maryland School of Nursing. And I worked with a colleague who is still an extremely good friend of mine. But he basically taught me how to talk to people. It sounds bizarre, but sometimes you just need to be aware of how to speak to people in different professions and what their roles are, and to treat people with appreciation. And I think that's super important. And it can be daunting, especially since, gosh, I know when I started, I really walked into it with some people, and sometimes unwittingly, and sometimes it was like, especially when you're starting out, you're very idealistic and you have a distinct way of thinking about way things are done. But I think ultimately you have to assume that your colleagues are good until proven otherwise, So I don't know if that's a helpful advice, but I think the important thing is to be able to read the rooms, or more or less. So.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. It wasn't a typical answer that you would get. So that's why I think it was very helpful.
Okay.
So I'm going to leave the chat open. And if anyone else has any questions that they might have, or if you want to come off mic, I know I still have a ton of other questions I could ask, but for the sake of time. Did you have a question, Michelle? I saw your mic bleep. No?
Nope, just coming back on camera.
Alrighty. Well, we do thank you so much, Mary, for your time with us today. We learned a lot. I know I definitely learned a lot. I got a lot of insights just between curation, libraries, archives. Being a student here at iSchool it's been awesome, but it's also been very confusing because there's so many different areas that I think I might want to work in and then learn something new and be like, oh, I want to do that too. And your role, they kind of have blended and meshed together. That kind of shows like you can do a little bit of everything.
Well, one thing that's important is that I'm a product of my generation. The push for people to, I think there's greater pressure for people to push into one area. But what I will say is that digital scholarship has opened up the opportunities for people who are kind of hybrid types. Mm-hmm. So Aisha, I know the work that you want to do in creating digital collections is actually important, and it is going to involve the skills that you're interested in. So it'll give you a good opportunity.
Go ahead, Marissa.
Thanks. I was trying to put this in the chat, but my finger's not quite that fast. Mary Beth, thank you so much for the presentation that you've given our student group this evening. I'd love to hear more about the community outreach work that you seem to be bridging between your roles as archivist and now as librarian. What does that look like?
That's actually a good question. Now I think of it, Aisha, when you asked about how the pandemic affected our work, I have to say that this has been a big time for organizations to turn inward and to really look at what they've done. I do think that it's been important in terms of planning and figuring out what we're about. What I will say is that I have had the opportunity on at least a few occasions, and I've been building towards more community outreach. Probably the very first thing I did when in 2021 that was kind of considered outside is I've worked a lot. I've worked with the Mount Zion Female Union Band Cemetery, which is now called an organization called Black Georgetown Foundation. And they were interested in recovering and restoring what really was a Black cemetery. And it was, and I had always known it as being a highly overgrown space. And it contrasted with this beautiful cemetery right next door that was basically established by wealthy white people. And anyway, the first thing we did was we went out and I helped them begin to document and set up a documentation system that involves students documenting the names of the people in that cemetery. So I've had that. And I also should say too, my whole career, I've been working with community organizations in the District of Columbia. So that means I was like ideally qualified to come in and help with this type of effort. But for me, the critical thing is that we did do an exhibition, and Aisha, I think you saw it, where I did an exhibition on it's really on the missions established by the Jesuits. And in Maryland, it was distinctive because it was the one place where the Jesuits had a significant Black membership. So I looked at that history, but that became an opportunity to bring in, the Jesuits, but also to bring in community members from the DC area, and also descendant groups. And I'm going to be working, I hope, more closely with descendants as they begin to research the Jesuit cemeteries. And I know that a lot of that work is now being done without consulting me because a lot of it's online and it's been digitized. So those are the areas. For on these grounds, we're actually, when we bring out the test site, we're going to have focus groups. We're actually paying the focus group participants. That's one of the things we're going to do. And they will be, the groups will be comprised of descendant groups and some of the local history community groups, again, the Mount Zion folks, and there's groups, interested in church history. So that's going to actually be an effort where we engage descendant and community groups at really the bottom level. If you think about descendant engagement and basically consulting them, because there are things like, what are the types of things you're going to use to search for? The faceted browse, how does that work for you? What fields are going to be really important for you to search? How about the way we're writing these things? What about the way we're identifying people? So all of these are questions, and just finding out what sources do you want us to concentrate on as we move forward. So all of this is a way of, first of all, bringing them in right away so that they understand what the resource is, but secondly, bringing them in so that we can listen to them and basically focus our work moving forward with them in mind. And the other thing too that's been really important that we've done at Georgetown is we've done a lot of work, and I the example with Mount Zion is a big one, where we've put them in touch with students who can help them. One of the things that came out of the work that I did that summer in Mount Zion, and I had nothing to do with this once it was done, but students who attended that event were so inspired by it that they actually developed a program where they did a walk through Georgetown towards that cemetery, and they did prayer circles using Muslim prayers as well as Christian prayers to basically honor the people who were buried there. And this was done really by the students. They did that. And if there's one thing about working with the students now and one thing that's really important that Georgetown is doing it by making it a part of the curriculum that every student is exposed to. The students are taking it on themselves, and they are working on reparative efforts in very creative ways. The student corps and the credit union, which are student-run organizations, are actually developing a scholarship fund for descendants. And they are interested in building as part of their culture and training people, getting the students who come in to consider what this process of repair should be. And to me, it's extremely important because, you have to reflect on how you got to the place that you're at and what it is that you can do to improve the position of other people around you. So I think it's a very fundamental thing. So this is all a very long way of saying that we've begun to do this work and we're still stymied by the fact that we require vaccination cards of everybody to come in, but it's slowly but surely we're beginning to open it up. We're at the point where I think in a few weeks and maybe now, I don't know, it doesn't, I haven't had a group come in recently, but people can arrive at the library, and as long as they can submit their documentation at the door, they'll be let in. And the next step will be getting rid of that process. You know, there will come a time where people will be able to come to into the buildings at Georgetown without showing documentation of vaccination. That will happen. It seems like it could be a long way away, but I think it's going to happen by probably next semester.
Awesome. All right, guys, that's it for us tonight. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us this evening. Thank you, Mayor Corrigan, for just giving us all of your wisdom and all of your knowledge. As always, I always learn a lot from you. So yeah, thank you, everybody, for coming this evening. And if you missed something or you want to go back and rewind and watch it, of course, it's going to be recorded and provided to us. It's going to be available.
This was my pleasure. Thank you very much.
All right. Good night, guys.